Welcome to this session of literary criticism, where we would look into modernism and the contribution of T.S. Eliot. Literary criticism in England in the 20th century witnessed the rise of a range of critical theories and practices due to the influence of studies related to psychology, sociology, anthropology, and economics. Modern criticism, in contrast to the criticism in the 19th century, saw the emergence of novel critical theories and insights from T.S. Eliot, F.R. Lewis, I.A. Richards, and William Emerson, who provided new interpretations of contemporary and earlier works. Till the turn of the century, criticism was dominated by Matthew Arnold and Walter Pater. The intellectual and objective criticism of Matthew Arnold and Walter Pater's impressionistic criticism were the leading critical practices. Matthew Arnold gave importance to high seriousness and criticism of life as categories crucial in estimating the value of poetry. Arnoldian criticism was a major cornerstone of Eliot's critical theories. Walter Pater advocated art for art's sake. Pater mentioned that the enjoyment of art and appreciation of beauty would benefit human life and art, and therefore it should be freed from any social obligation. His criticism later proved to be the source of inspiration to the Bloomsbury group of critics that included E. M. Forster, Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey, and Clive Bell. These critics assessed a work of literature on the basis of the pleasure that was obtained from it. Let us now look into the important critics and movements of the 20th century. The 20th century continued to follow the critical dictums of Matthew Arnold and Walter Pater. A few university professors like George Saintsbury, Edward Dowden, A.C. Bradley, and Oliver Elton collected facts and evaluated a writer, but did not participate in giving precise points of view or propound new theories or principles. Another group of scholars focused on textual editing. For instance, Furness, Dover Wilson, Greg Pollard provided authentic versions of old texts. At this juncture, the contribution of T. E. Hume proved to be of immense significance to modernist critics and writers. Hume's points of view were informed by his deep scholarship, aided by contributions from religion, the classics, and tragedy as a dramatic art form. He believed that tragedy is the highest form of expression and man's sufferings arise from his imperfections. In contrast, God is perfect and infinite. Man's imperfection does not enable him to achieve artistic perfection. In this way, Hume expressed his rejection of the romantic concept of poetry as inspiration. His anti-romantic and anti-humanistic point of view and his stress on the need of order and discipline was wholeheartedly embraced by T.S. Eliot, the towering modernist icon. Hume expresses the view that poetry should express the vague and fleeting impressions passing through the mind of the poet, and he finds that these impressions could be best expressed through free verse. He also argued that concepts that are explained through the use of accurate and concrete images become a source of inspiration. Hume's views on precise and pithy expressions influenced Ezra Pound and the Imagist school. In 1912, the literary magazine New Age featured 5 of Hume's poems, which were then reprinted in Pound's poetry collection's repositories. Eliot paid tribute to Pound by saying, I quote, "Hume is classical, reactionary and revolutionary. He is the antipodes of the eclectic, tolerant and democratic mind of the end of the last century." Unquote. The First World War was a watershed movement that affected literary output and criticism in several ways. Literature and art was never the same again. Contribution from psychoanalysis, Expressionism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Imagism, New Criticism, the Symbolist movement and archetypal criticism provided fresh insight into the study of art and literature. Christopher Caldwell showed how Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Coleridge and the other romantics could be studied against the background of social and cultural changes due to the new movements that emerged. Moreover, Karl Marx and his concept of class struggle saw the emergence of Marxism. Class conflict is depicted in the works of David Dadaism. In the book Society and Literature, Dadaism explains how economy is reflected in literary output. We move on to some of the movements that were very popular during the 20th century. We begin with Expressionism. Benedetto Croce, who lived between 1866 and 1952, is an Italian idealist philosopher, historian and politician. He had a profound influence on art and criticism in England. According to him, art is a form of expression and criticism is the study of that expression. The movement called Expressionism arose out of this thought. Expressionism takes into account the vivid pictures that arise constantly in the mind of the poet, which should be expressed spontaneously without any attempt at organizing them. Expressionism deals with the fragmentary and chaotic nature of the vague sensations that permeate the consciousness of the poet. German Expressionism was explicit in the works of Vincent van Gogh, Edvard Munch and James Ensor, each of whom in the period between 1885 and 1900 evolved a highly personal painting style where the most subjective outlooks or states of mind were expressed through color and line. In literature, Expressionism emerged as a movement in Germany, primarily in opposition to the bourgeois ideology, complacency in social life, urbanization and mechanization, especially during the First World War. Rather than depicting the outside world and the changes happening there, the writers concentrated on the inner state of mind of the characters. The focus was on projecting the anxiety, frustration and troubled emotional states of the characters that had to struggle against the changing social, political and economic conditions that followed in the wake and aftermath of the First World War. August Strindberg and Frank Wedekind were notable forerunners of the expressionist drama. The other playwrights of the movement were George Kaiser, Ernest Stoller, Paul Kornfeld, Fritz von Andra, Walter Hans Clever and Reinhard Goering. The first expressionist play was Reinhard Johannes Sorge's Der Bettler, which could be translated into English as The Beggar, and it was written in 1912 but not performed until 1917. The next most influential movement is Dadaism. Dadaism is recognized to be a nihilistic and anti-aesthetic movement in the arts that flourished primarily in Zurich, Switzerland, New York City, Berlin, Cologne and Hanover in Germany, and Paris in the early 20th century. The Dadaists rejected traditional modes of artistic creation and worked with collage, photomontage and found object construction rather than with the media of painting and sculpture. While the Dadaists in Zurich were concerned with issues surrounding the First World War, Dadaists in New York focused more on mocking the art establishment. The Dada movement is involved in depicting the bizarre, the irrational and the fantastic. It was the impetus to the Surrealist movement. Thus said, let us look into the movement called Surrealism. It is a visual art and literature movement precisely that emerged in Europe between the First and the Second World Wars. Surrealism, as I said earlier, grew out of the earlier Dada movement that was anti-art and resisted reason. Surrealism emphasized positive expression, where the conscious and unconscious realms of experience would fuse into each other, and the world of dream and fantasy would join with the everyday rational world in an absolute reality, which is also called a surreality. Surrealism attributes artistic creation to dreams and the influence of spirits that inspire the artist with forms and images. The British poet and critic Herbert Reed was influenced by this movement. Reed was the interpreter of modern art movement between 1930 and 1960. Let us move into the contribution of psychology. Rather than calling this to be a movement, let us see what psychology had to contribute to the literature of the period, mainly influenced by Freud, Jung and Bergson. Freud believed that the suppression of the sex instinct results in frustration and neurosis, and art is the expression of this neurosis. As Freud himself had used his wide reading and deep understanding of literature to explain his psychological theories, it was only natural that psychological framework and methodology were used to analyze and interpret several important works of the earlier writers. For instance, Shakespeare's character Hamlet was interpreted in the light of Freud's theory of Oedipus complex. The motives and processes that lead to a particular work of art were studied and new dimensions were added to literature. Soon the impact of literature on the mind of the readers began to be explained in psychological terms. I.A. Richards, the new critic, is of the opinion that the pleasure of literature arises from the fact that it helps to maintain a healthy equilibrium between the instinct and impulses of the readers. The cathartic effect of tragedy implies that a balance is achieved between fear and the impulse to withdraw and express pity. We move on to archetypal criticism. The term archetype was adopted and popularized by the writings of the psychologist Carl Jung. He formulated a theory of the collective unconscious. He explains that human experience is transferred to successive generations and that primordial image patterns and situations evoke similar feelings in both reader and author. The movement was given impetus by Maud Botkin's Archetypal Patterns in Poetry, published in 1934. Derived from the Greek word archetypos, the word archetype means original pattern. In criticism, it refers to a primordial image, character or pattern of circumstances that recurs throughout literature and thought consistently enough to be considered a universal concept or situation. The archetypal approach tries to demonstrate the presence of some basic pattern of myth or common heritage of mankind in a work of art. The critics of this school believe that civilized man unconsciously preserves these areas of knowledge which he articulates indirectly in myth. Maud Bodkin and James Hillman are the other well-known archetypal critics. Closely related to all these movements is the Symbolist movement. The Symbolist movement is an organized literary and artistic movement that originated with a group of French poets in the late 19th century. It spread to painting and the theatre and influenced the European and American literatures of the 20th century. Symbolist artists desired to express individual emotional experience through the subtle and suggestive symbolized language. The Symbolist poets try to discover hidden meaning and significance in poetry. Some of the important Symbolist poets include the Frenchmen Stéphane Mallarmé, Paul Verlaine, Arthur Rimbaud and Jules Laforgue. Symbolist forerunners as Verlaine and Rimbaud were influenced by the poetry and thoughts of Charles Baudelaire, particularly by the poems in his Les Fleurs du Mal, published in 1857. The rise of new criticism was very important to this period because it was the most influential school of criticism in the first half of the 20th century. After the Second World War, new criticism became a prominent mode of literary criticism. The term new criticism was first used by Joel Spingarn. The origin of this practice was found in the writings of T.E. Hume. The new critics rejected all extrinsic readings of literature. They rejected biographical, historical, sociological and comparative approach of conventional criticism. They believed that such considerations as the traditional division of literature into periods and groups for the purpose of criticism are extrinsic and irrelevant because works of art should be judged only on the basis of their merit. Their criticism is therefore described to be intrinsic or ontological. A poem, a piece of literature, is a thing in itself with a definite entity of its own. It is independent of the poet and the socio-cultural context in which it is produced. Emphasis is laid on word-by-word analysis and interpretation of texts. The music of a poem, its imagery and versification, its total structure must be taken into account to arrive at its meaning. Words must be studied with reference to their sound, prosody and their emotional and symbolic significance. New criticism is therefore textual, and the new critics give importance to the study and interpretation of literary classics. Hence, the method that the new critics followed is also known as textual criticism. Eliot was against close scrutiny of a work of art. He believed that the poem is a thing and it must be studied in itself. He was against the new critics who pressed the words too closely, and he labeled them lemon squeezer critics, and their practice was called lemon squeezer criticism. Let us discuss the contribution of T.S. Eliot. Eliot emerged as one of the most prominent literary figures in the 20th century British literature. His contribution to literature is of immense significance because he contributed to all the genres of literature. Eliot's poetic genius was first noticed by Ezra Pound, who assisted him in the publication of the work in a number of magazines, most notably the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock in the collection Poetry in 1915. His first book of poems, Prufrock and Other Observations, was published in 1917. With the publication of the monumental poem in the 20th century, The Wasteland, in 1922, Eliot's reputation began to grow phenomenally. By 1930, and for the next 30 years, he became the most dominant figure in English literary criticism as well as literature. As a poet, he praised the English metaphysical poets of the 17th century, especially John Donne, and the 19th century French symbolist poets that included Baudelaire and Jules Laforgue. He was drawn by their radical innovations in poetic technique and subject matter. His poems in many ways voiced the disillusionment of the post-First World War generation had with the literary and social values and conventions of the Victorian era. As a critic, he made an enormous impact on contemporary literary taste. His conversion to Orthodox Christianity in the late 30s was based on social and religious conservatism, the signs of which were already there in his early literary career. He received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948. We shall now outline the poetry of T.S. Eliot. His contributions include collected poems published in 1962, the complete poems and plays published in 1952, 4 quartets in 1943, Burnt Norton in 1941. The Dry Salvages was also published in 1941. East Cocker was published in 1940. Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats 1939. Ash Wednesday 1930. Poems 1909 to 1925 was published in 1925, and the most famous The Wasteland was published in 1922. Even before that, he published a group of poems collectively called Poems in 1919, and the earliest one, Prufrock and Other Observations, published in 1917. His prose collections include the 1965 publication To Criticize the Critic, On Poetry and Poets, published in 1957, the 1954 publication Religious Drama, Medieval and Modern, The Three Voices of Poetry in 1954, Poetry and Drama 1951, the 1949 publication Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. Even previously, The Classics and the Man of Letters 1942, The Idea of a Christian Society 1940, Essays Ancient and Modern 1936, Elizabethan Plays 1934, The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism in 1933. After Strange Gods was also published the same year, 1933. John Dryden 1932, Thoughts After Lambeth 1931, Tradition and Experimentation in Present Day Literature 1929. The same year he also published Dante. In 1928 came out For Lancelot Andrews, 1922 Andrew Marvell, and the most famous The Sacred Wood in 1920. His dramatic collections include dramas in the form of blank verse, and they are also known as heightened prose. The first among them is Sweeney Agonistes, published in 1924, but it wasn't performed until 1934. The verse drama Murder in the Cathedral 1935, on the theme of the murder of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral is perhaps his best known play. His later plays include The Family Reunion 1939, The Cocktail Party 1950, The Confidential Clerk 1954 and The Elder Statesman in 1959, although on secular subjects, often using plots from Greek drama, they also explore fundamentally religious concepts. In a playful vein, he wrote Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats in 1939, which was later adapted for the stage as The Musical Cats, brought out in 1981 by Andrew Lloyd Webber. His fiction, or perhaps I should say the only work of fiction by Eliot, was published in 2 parts in 1917 in The Little Review, and it is Eeldrop and Appleplex. His essays include The Use of Poetry and The Use of Criticism in 1933, After Strange Gods in 1934. The same year he published Elizabethan Essays. In 1936 came out Essays Ancient and Modern. The Idea of a Christian Society was published in 1940. A Choice of Kipling's Verse, published in 1941, made by Eliot with an essay on Rudyard Kipling, published in London by Faber and Faber. Notes Towards the Definition of Culture was published in 1948. In 1951 came his very famous Poetry and Drama, which was followed by The Three Voices of Poetry in 1954 and The Frontiers of Criticism in 1956. On Poetry and Poets was published in 1957. The publications posthumously published are To Criticize the Critic 1965, The Wasteland Facsimile Edition in 1974, Inventions of the March Hare Poems 1909 to 1917 in 1996. The most important collections of Eliot's manuscripts can be found at the Houghton Library, Howard University, the New York Public Library and the libraries of King's and Magdalen Colleges, Cambridge University. His critical thoughts were first published in the form of articles and essays in various periodicals and journals. These have now been included in several books, namely The Use of Poetry and The Use of Criticism 1933, The Idea of a Christian Society in 1939, followed by Notes Towards a Definition of Culture in 1948 and Selected Essays. The 3rd edition was published in 1951. Apart from this, we also have On Poetry and Poets in 1957, to be followed by To Criticize the Critic in 1965. Eliot is known for his essays Tradition and the Individual Talent, Poetry and Drama, The Function of Criticism, The English Metaphysical Poets, The Frontiers of Criticism, 18th Century Poetry and Poets, The Perfect Critic, The Imperfect Critic, The Four Elizabethan Dramatists, A Dialogue on Dramatic Poetry, and Rhetoric and Poetic Drama, among others. Eliot has also coined certain phrases like dissociation of sensibility, objective correlative, and unified sensibility that are popular and widely studied. Let us now look into each one. We would first find out what exactly Eliot meant by using the phrase objective correlative. This particular phrase, objective correlative, was included by Eliot in his essay Hamlet and His Problem. According to Eliot, the expression of emotion in poetry should imply an appropriate objective correlative. He says that objective correlative is, I quote, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula, unquote, for the poet's emotion, so that when the external facts are given, the emotion is at once evoked. To explain this further, let us analyze the two plays by Shakespeare, precisely Hamlet and Macbeth. Eliot calls the play Hamlet an artistic failure because the external situations do not adequately represent the effects of a mother's guilt on her son. The disgust of Prince Hamlet is presented in excess in the play, and the audience is unable to relate or feel as Prince Hamlet does because the images, characters and actions in the play only externalize the disturbed emotional state of Prince Hamlet. How about Macbeth? In this play, the dramatist conveys the agony of Lady Macbeth through the sleepwalking scene. And he does this by employing instances that show an unconscious repetition of her past actions that reveal her guilt within. Her despair is made objective so that it can be seen as well as felt simultaneously by the audience. The external situation in this case adequately conveys the emotional upheaval in Lady Macbeth. Rather than imposing the emotions of the character directly onto the audience, the dramatist uses a situation or chain of events which indirectly convey the emotions of the character to the audience. In this way, without the use of direct verbal expression, situations and events are employed to arouse similar emotions in the reader, and the emotions get depersonalized. We shall be looking into what Eliot actually means by saying depersonalization in the coming sessions. Before that, let us look into the other phrases, precisely unification of sensibility and dissociation of sensibility. Eliot employed the phrase unification of sensibility in his essay, The English Metaphysical Poets. By unification of sensibility, Eliot means a fusion of thought and feeling, a recreation of thoughts into feelings. It could also be a direct sensuous apprehension of thought. The metaphysical poets showed unification of sensibility, wherein there was a union of thought and feeling. However, a dissociation of sensibility had set in the late 17th century, where there was a split between thought and feeling. This is evident in the poetry of Dryden and Milton. Present poetry has not been able to recover from such disharmony between thought and feeling, according to Eliot. In order to express his appreciation of the metaphysical poets, Eliot explains, I quote, "Tennyson and Browning are poets, and they think, but they do not feel their thought as immediately as the odor of a rose. A thought to Donne was an experience. It modified his sensibility," unquote. Eliot sees the harmonious blend of thought and emotions in the poetry of Donne, but Browning, whereas Tennyson, failed to transmit ideas into emotions and sensations. Great poetry cannot be written by employing logic or the intellect. A mature poet can experience or feel his thoughts as he does the odor of a rose, while an immature poet cannot. A commemorative plaque on the church wall bears his chosen epitaph, the lines chosen from 4 quartets. "In my beginning is my end. In my end is my beginning." These lines summarize or estimate the worth of Eliot as a towering figure in England. Not only in the 20th century, his effect is also felt in the years after. Let us summarize what we have done so far. Various critical theories influenced the literature of the modern period in England. Modern criticism in England benefited from the contribution of several movements and critics from different parts of the world. T.S. Eliot, F.R. Lewis, I.A. Richards, William Emerson, Hume and Ezra Pound, to name a few critics in schools, area of study and movements like psychoanalysis, expressionism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Imagism, new criticism, symbolist movement and archetypal criticism provide fresh insights into the study of art and literature. Hume maintained an anti-romantic and anti-humanistic stand and was supported by Eliot. F.R. Lewis, I.A. Richards and William Ensign developed new criticism that concentrated on the text. The shift from the importance given to the author in the preceding age to the text in the modern period is noteworthy. Freud, Jung and Bergson explored the inner recesses of the human mind that had never been heard before. Critical insights from psychology provided the ground for fresh interpretations of older texts. Movements as Expressionism, Dadaism, Surrealism and Imagism that influenced art provided new openings to understand literature through verbal expression of art. England became home to several movements that influenced literature as never before. T.S. Eliot stands out as an exemplary literary figure who contributed immensely to all the genres of literature. All this being said, will be followed by a series of questions that you would have to answer. Once you answer the questions, you would have an insight into the contribution of not only T.S. Eliot, but also of all the other figures who played a significant role in changing the dimension of literary criticism and literature in the modern period. Until we meet next time with further elaborations, thank you.